Welcome back to the deep dive. So, you folks have sent us quite a bit of research and articles about vaccine contamination.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely complex.
It is.
And to be honest, sometimes pretty heated.
Absolutely. It's interesting because while vaccine contamination is incredibly rare, it has happened.
Right.
And looking at those cases helps us understand the amazing safety measures that are in place now.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got excerpts from a really well-known medical text called Myler's Side Effects of Drugs Used in Anesthesia, along with some information from the CDC and the FDA, even some stuff from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
Yeah, let's
That's a lot to unpack.
It is. Let's start with Myler's. It's a really in-depth look at the history of drug side effects, and it shows just how carefully these things have been documented and studied for decades.
Yeah, you know what's kind of wild about this book is the story of how it came about.
Oh, yeah.
Leopold Myler,
Right.
the author, he actually had a severe reaction himself.
That's right. He was treated for tuberculosis and had such a bad reaction that it kind of sparked this whole passion project for him to meticulously document these reactions. You know, he experienced firsthand how important it is to understand those potential downsides
Right.
of even life-saving drugs.
Which brings us to a point about this excerpt.
Yeah,
It doesn't actually focus on vaccines,
right.
right? It's more about anesthetics.
Exactly. But that's what's so interesting. Even though it's focused on anesthetics, Myler's gives us this really valuable window into pharmaceutical safety as a whole. I mean, the meticulous research and these incredibly high reporting standards,
Yeah,
they just demonstrate a commitment to patient safety that extends to all medical interventions and vaccines.
including vaccines.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move over to those FDA and CDC materials.
Right.
You specifically flagged sources about thimerosal, that mercury-based preservative
Yeah.
that used to be in some vaccines.
Yeah.
I can see why that would raise a red flag for folks.
Of course. I mean, mercury is not something you really want to mess with. And there was a lot of public concern, particularly about a possible link to developmental issues.
Like autism.
Yeah, like autism.
I'm actually really curious about that. What does the science actually say about that link?
Well, after a ton of research, the scientific consensus is that there's no evidence to support a connection between thimerosal in vaccines and autism.
Oh, wow.
But even though the evidence wasn't there, thimerosal was removed from childhood vaccines in the US by 2001.
So they removed it even without clear scientific backing,
Yeah,
just from public concern.
exactly. It's a fascinating intersection of public perception and scientific practice.
It really is.
Yeah, it's worth noting, though, that some multi-dose flu vaccines do still contain thimerosal.
Okay, so this whole discussion brings up a really crucial point
Yeah,
that applies to any medical intervention.
right.
Whether we're talking about the anesthetics, from Myler's, or vaccines, it's always about weighing benefits against risks.
Absolutely. Every medical procedure, even taking like an over-the-counter pain reliever, carries some degree of risk.
And in the case of vaccines, the potential risks, which are already super rare, have to be balanced against the huge benefits of preventing diseases that could be really dangerous.
You're exactly right. The impact of vaccination on global health is undeniable. We've seen massive drops in diseases like measles, mumps, and rubella, all thanks to vaccines.
Now, you also sent over an excerpt about pediatric research from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about this whole thimerosal thing.
Yeah.
Even though the science wasn't clear-cut,
Right.
it was still removed.
Right.
So was that an ethical decision? I mean, was it the right call?
That's a tough question. This excerpt highlights a historical example that really shows how complex ethical considerations can be, especially when we're talking about medical research in children.
Okay.
Back in the early 1900s, there was this smallpox vaccination campaign in Germany that went really wrong.
Whoa, what happened?
It had some unintended and pretty tragic consequences. Yeah, and it sparked a huge debate about informed consent and the responsibility researchers have when conducting studies on children.
So kind of like the thimerosal situation, it brought up questions about
Yeah.
making decisions based on public perception versus hard scientific evidence
Right.
when children are involved.
Exactly. The German smallpox campaign reminds us that we need to think about ethical considerations at every stage of medical research, from designing a study
Right.
to putting it into practice.
This excerpt also talks about a study where they interviewed parents about letting their kids be part of a placebo-controlled drug trial.
Yeah,
And I'm guessing it wasn't as straightforward as parents just being for or against it.
you're right. What's fascinating is that the study found a whole bunch of things influencing those parental decisions.
Oh, really?
It makes it clear that it's not just about yes or no.
So what were some of those factors? Were parents worried about the placebo or the actual drug being tested?
Both, actually. Some parents were really hesitant about placebos being used, while others were more worried about the potential risks of the actual drug.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And of course, every parent brings their own beliefs and experiences to the table when making these kinds of decisions for their children.
Absolutely. It really highlights the importance of clear communication between researchers and parents. Addressing their concerns head on
Right.
and making sure parents are totally comfortable with their decision
Yeah.
is crucial. Ultimately, building that parental trust is paramount when it comes to pediatric research. This idea of parental trust in research actually ties directly back to those materials you sent about vaccine contamination. It's not just about the science, it's about addressing those human anxieties and building confidence in the systems designed to keep people safe.
That's such a good point. So much of the conversation around vaccines is about trust, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about contamination, even if it's incredibly rare.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the biggest challenges, public perception. Even when the risks are incredibly low, that public concern can sometimes overshadow those benefits.
The thimerosal situation is a perfect example of that.
Yeah,
Even though the science didn't point to a problem,
right.
the public concern was so strong that it led to changes.
Exactly.
So how do we deal with that? How do we help people feel confident about vaccine safety with all of the information and misinformation swirling around out there?
Well, it's definitely not easy, but I think a good starting point is transparency. Being open and honest about how vaccines are made, how they're tested, and what safety measures are in place can go a long way in building trust.
So instead of just saying vaccines are safe,
Mhm.
we need to show people why they're safe.
Exactly.
Walk them through the process.
Exactly. And it's not just about telling people, trust us, we've got this. It's about showing them the data, explaining the research,
Right.
and being willing to answer their questions openly and honestly.
I imagine that's especially important when it comes to those historical cases of contamination.
Yeah,
Even though they're rare, they happen, and people want to understand what went wrong and what has changed since then.
you're absolutely right. Transparency means acknowledging those past mistakes, explaining what we've learned from them,
Right.
and showing how those lessons have led to improvements in the system.
So we've talked about the importance of transparency, but how do we actually get that information out there? How do we cut through all the noise and make sure people are getting accurate, reliable information about vaccine safety?
That's where those organizations like the CDC and the World Health Organization play such a crucial role. They're trusted sources of scientific information, and they've done a ton of work to make that information easy to understand and accessible to everyone.
But what about all the misinformation online? It feels like there's this constant battle between facts and fiction, especially on social media.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge hurdle. We're bombarded with information from all sides, and it can be really tough to figure out what's credible and what's not.
So how do we help people become better at spotting misinformation, especially about something as important as vaccines?
It all comes down to media literacy. We need to equip people with the skills to evaluate information critically, to question sources,
Yeah.
and to recognize when something might be biased or misleading. Think of it like giving everyone a toolkit to become a vaccine detective.
I love that. So instead of just telling people what to believe, we teach them how to think for themselves
Yeah.
and evaluate information on their own. But how do we actually do that? How do we teach media literacy, especially to people who might not even realize they need it?
Well, it needs to be a multi-pronged approach. It starts in schools, teaching kids from a young age how to be critical thinkers and responsible consumers of information. But it also involves working with adults, providing workshops, online resources, and public awareness campaigns that highlight the importance of checking sources and evaluating information carefully.
I guess it's also about promoting those trusted sources of information,
Yeah.
like the CDC and WHO,
Absolutely.
and making sure people know where to turn when they have questions or concerns. So we're not just teaching them how to think, but also giving them the resources to find the right information.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to take control of their own health information and to feel confident in their ability to make informed decisions based on facts, not fear.
And that leads us to another big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
How do we communicate about those incredibly rare cases of contamination without making people panic?
Yeah.
It's like a tightrope walk.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about finding that delicate balance between transparency and reassurance. We need to be upfront about the fact that yes, contamination has happened,
Yeah.
but also emphasize those extraordinary steps taken to make sure it doesn't happen again.
So it's almost like saying we've learned from the past, and because of those lessons, we're even better protecting people now.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And a big part of that reassurance comes from explaining the rigorous safety protocols that are in place at every stage of the process.
Okay, I'm ready for a deep dive into those protocols.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that every batch of vaccine undergoes all sorts of testing. What exactly are they testing for?
Well, one of the most important tests is for sterility. They literally take samples from each batch and try to grow anything that might be lurking in there. Bacteria, fungi, anything that shouldn't be there.
So it's like putting the vaccine under a microscope and making sure it's perfectly clean. No uninvited guests.
Exactly. And they don't stop there. They also test for potency, which means making sure the vaccine actually contains the right amount of the active ingredients to be effective.
It's amazing to think about the level of detail that goes into this process.
Yeah.
It's not just about slapping a label on a vial and calling it a day.
Not at all. And the testing doesn't end there. There are also systems in place to monitor the safety of vaccines once they're out in the world and being used.
You're talking about vaccine surveillance programs, right? Those systems that track and analyze data about any side effects that people report.
That's right. It's like a massive early warning system, constantly scanning for any signs of a problem.
So they're not just testing the vaccine itself, they're also watching how it's affecting people in the real world.
Exactly.
That's reassuring to know.
Absolutely. And it's not just about catching problems, it's also about continually learning and improving. The data from these surveillance programs is used to refine recommendations, update guidelines,
Right.
and make sure we're always using the safest and most effective vaccines possible.
It sounds incredibly thorough. What are some of the biggest challenges in maintaining this level of scrutiny?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is simply the scale of the operation.
Yeah.
We're talking about billions of doses of vaccines being produced and distributed around the world. Keeping track of all that data and ensuring consistency across different manufacturers and regions is a massive undertaking.
It makes you realize just how many people and resources are dedicated to keeping this system running smoothly. And that brings us back to the idea of trust. It's not just about the science itself. It's about having faith in the people and institutions responsible for upholding these safety standards.